things can get worse after White House meetings, not necessarily better. I think this could be a status quo after the fact, and quite frankly, perhaps an opportunity for South Africa to get a little more influence on its positions. But there's a broader dynamic on cutting back on aid and changing trade that affects many countries, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So for South Africa, it's still going to be a very hard slog. Props to the president for giving it a shot. But President Trump, he really did, I believe, embarrass the United States today with that episode.
Now, in a televised news conference this evening, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to take complete control of the entire Gaza Strip and warned that the current military offensive will continue.
Our forces are catching more and more territories, eliminate and clear out Hamas terrorists. All of the Gaza Strip will be under the security control of Israel.
Well, it comes a day after the Foreign Secretary David Lammy called Israel's military escalation in Gaza morally unjustifiable, and the UK suspended talks on a trade deal with Israel. Let's talk to Joel Rubin. He is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the United States. Good to have you with us, Joel.
Always. Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to go back to that clash at the White House in just a moment. But first of all, on what we were hearing there from Benjamin Netanyahu, growing international pressure on him to end the military offensive, to allow more aid in. It was a pretty defiant message, wasn't it?
Yeah, Carol, it really was. I mean, the prime minister, he's known for delivering a message when he has to, and he delivered a very, very clear message in his viewpoint now. He hasn't done this in 5 or so months, and it's the first big one he's done since President Trump got into office. And I think he just views this now as the final stage moment of Israel's invasion and incursion into Gaza. And I don't think that we'll see any brakes applied from the Trump team either on this. So this is a real significant decision by Prime Minister Netanyahu.
What about these reports that President Trump is getting increasingly exasperated with Benjamin Netanyahu, that he has been distancing himself somewhat from the Israeli leader?
You know, on the surface, one could say, yes, there's some accuracy to that. Look, President Trump didn't go to Israel during his stop in the Gulf, and there were some concerns about that from the pro-Israel community, but it really wasn't on the itinerary ever. And I think that, actions speak louder than words. Maybe a bit of a downplaying for the audience that he went to, but overall, President Trump's not saying anything or doing anything that would slow down the prime minister's decision-making. He is a little bit on Iran, but not so much on Iran. And certainly when it comes to the Palestinians, not at all.
But on that trip to the Middle East, he was talking to a lot of Gulf leaders who do want President Trump to put pressure on Netanyahu to end the military offensive, to accept a ceasefire, which could lead to the release of more hostages. And we saw the US dealing pretty much directly with Hamas to get one of those hostages out.
Yeah, Carol, a couple of things on that. It's a very good point. Look, my criticism of the trip is that it really didn't hit the hard issues like the Gaza war, or even Iran. It was really a commercial trip. The president might as well have just been our commerce secretary there. And that means that he came back with some deliverables on the economic side, but really not much on the security side. And when it comes to the release of Adnan Alexander, which was tremendously important, that was the last American living hostage, stuck underground in these horrific Hamas tunnels. So now it's a different dynamic. They're all Israeli or third country nationals that are alive or deceased underground. So I think, Hamas may have thought it would get something for that. It didn't get anything for that. it's going to have to return all the hostages if it's going to see Israel cease its operations.
Well, let's turn to that extraordinary clash at the White House. The South African president hoped his talks with President Trump would focus on trade, and the meeting began with these cordial exchanges with Cyril Ramaphosa saying he wanted to reset relations between the two countries. But President Trump then turned to the TV screens that were set up in the room.
It has to be responded to.
Yeah, sure.
Let me see the articles, please, if you would. And turn the lights down.
Well, there were then videos showed which appeared to show rallies of prominent opposition figures chanting, "Kill the white farmer."
Never be scared to kill a revolution. Demand that at some point there must be killing, because the killing is part of a revolutionary act.
Well, Cyril Ramaphosa tried to respond.
Our government policy is completely against what he was saying, even in the parliament. And they're a small minority party, which is allowed to exist in terms of our constitution.
But you do allow them to take land.
No.
You do allow them to take land.
Nobody can take land.
And then when they take the land, they kill the white farmer. And when they kill the white farmer, nothing happens to them.
Well, just going back to you, Joel Rubin, what did you make of that extraordinary confrontation?
God, this was the right-wing echo chamber bubble of social media finally making its first appearance in the Oval Office in a dramatic way. And that's what's driving this whole bizarre, concocted narrative of the oppressed Afrikaners suffering outlandishly compared to the rest of South Africa. Look, let's be clear. South Africa is a very difficult country with a significant amount of violence and crime. The Afrikaners should not be targeted, nor should anybody be targeted. But the narrative here in the ecosphere, in the social media echo chamber of the right wing, is that they're being targeted alone, and it's white ethnic cleansing, and nothing could be further. But that's where President Trump's coming from. And I have to say, just one more thing on this. President Ramaphosa did a great job at handling this. He understood what he was getting into. He probably knew ahead of time that something was going to happen, but no one would have predicted this exactly. But, he took the criticism. He gave reasoned responses back. I think he presented very well in the face of what was a very surreal diplomatic engagement.
And do you get the sense then that Donald Trump just wanted to address or to amplify these claims of a genocide of white farmers? I mean, I'm looking at some of the figures. It's difficult to get a breakdown, but you had almost 7,000 people murdered in South Africa between October and December. The overwhelming majority of them were black. There were at least a dozen very high-profile attacks on white farmers. Why do you think that President Trump chose to really amplify this narrative that there is a wider genocide going on?
This has been a major talking point for a number of years by very influential leading figures in the far right platforms of the internet and of social media and of our media environment here in the United States. A very anti-South Africa position using the Afrikaner argument to try to amplify views of whites being targeted unfairly. And it got to President Trump. His policy now on refugee absorption of Afrikaners alone and not other South Africans who are also facing the same hardships should make it very clear where he's biased. But all that said, the president of South Africa had to come here to try to restore the trade and aid relationship, get things back on a solid footing. And this was the price. Unfortunately, President Trump is playing to a far-right base on this issue that it gets really animated by this disinformation.
And where do you think then that this clash leaves relations between the two countries? They were at a pretty low ebb beforehand. Where does this leave relations between South Africa and the United States now?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. After what we saw, Carol, with President Zelensky, things can get worse after White House meetings, not necessarily better. I think this could be a status quo after the fact, and quite frankly, perhaps an opportunity for South Africa to get a little more influence on its positions. But there's a broader dynamic on cutting back on aid and changing trade that affects many countries, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So for South Africa, it's still going to be a very hard slog. Props to the president for giving it a shot. But President Trump, he really did, I believe, embarrass the United States today with that episode.
Joel Rubin, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Really good to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always. Thanks, Carol.